uncovering a lesser-known chapter in history, the account of how power relations combined with cruelty during a dark era, from hidden narratives to sinister power plays. Join us as we reveal the terrible truth of black slave men being brutally abused by white women, exploring the obscured history of interactions between black male slaves and white women reveals a complex tapestry of power dynamics and relationships that challenge conventional understandings. While not all instances of sexual encounters between white women and black male slaves can be categorized as explicit rape, it is widely acknowledged that the pervasive backdrop of slavery taints even seemingly affectionate connections. While the nuances of power, agency, and consent are deeply entwined in these interactions, it is clear that these women utilize their elevated status to manipulate oppressive gender norms. Through exploiting racial dynamics, these women reinforce their own dominance while perpetuating the subjugation of black male slaves, demonstrating how intersectionality can illuminate the multifaceted dimensions of historical abuse. Planter-class white women assumed the role of guardians of the household, tasked with upholding traditional Christian values and maintaining harmony within the domestic realm. Their worth was derived from their skills in homemaking, nurturing instincts, and, notably, their virtue. This deeply rooted emphasis on purity was underscored by societal expectations and reinforced through cultural expressions, as demonstrated by a letter addressed to a South Carolinian periodical targeting young women. In the prevailing mindset, women were perceived as physically and intellectually inferior to men, yet their piety, purity, and moral rectitude were regarded as surpassing. The honor and virtue attributed to white women, particularly those of the upper echelons of society, were closely intertwined with notions of sexual purity. This virtue was upheld through self-restraint, prudence, and modesty that extended to every facet of life. But that's not all. As we dig deeper, we'll unravel the complex motives and psychological undercurrents that fueled this dark chapter. So stay tuned to witness history in a new light. This stringent control over white women's virtue was intricately connected to the Southern way of life, entwined with the pillars of white supremacy, slavery, and the planter aristocracy. The contrast between the purported purity of white women and the sexualized black Jezebel stereotype further served to underscore the supposed superiority of white womanhood and, by extension, whiteness itself. As historian Catherine Clinton observes, the perceived purity of plantation mistresses upheld the broader claims of a superior civilization. The purity of white women remained sacrosanct, as the potential contamination from slavery was deemed a threat to the entire societal structure. The consequences for white women involved in affairs with slaves were far from uniform and often carried heavy public shame. When news of a planter's daughter or wife engaging in a relationship with a slave emerged, elaborate efforts were made to conceal any resulting pregnancies. In instances where such pregnancies could not be concealed, desperate measures like selling the resulting child into slavery or even resorting to infanticide were not uncommon strategies employed to avert scandal. It's crucial to note that planter-class women were, in many ways, treated as possessions of their husbands. Their autonomy and mobility were severely restricted, exemplified by the requirement of a male chaperone for any travel. Shockingly, spousal abuse was often seen as an acceptable means for men to exert control over their wives. While the description of Southern plantation mistresses as prisoners in disguise might be an exaggeration, it underscores the reality that these women, despite their privileged racial and class status, grappled with a set of oppressive patriarchal constraints. Behind closed doors, many plantation women harbored discontent over their lack of freedom and the expectation that they maintain an image of dutifulness, obedience, pleasantness, and cheerfulness. This was juxtaposed with the knowledge that their husbands were involved in relationships with or even perpetrating sexual violence against female slaves. The presence of mixed-race slave children who were unmistakably their husbands' offspring served as a constant reminder, inflicting both humiliation and heartache upon these women. The lives of Southern women were punctuated by unique challenges. Marrying at younger ages compared to their Northern counterparts, often around 15 or 16, these women frequently found themselves abandoned on plantations while their husbands embarked on journeys for business, pleasure, or military service. The role of a plantation mistress was frequently marked by loneliness and melancholy, a stark contrast to the veneer of privilege that their race and class offered. These historical narratives reveal the intricate ways in which white women's lives were shaped and confined by the norms of their time, both within the context of their relationships with slaves and in their broader roles as wives and mistresses within the Southern society of the era. While affairs between planter-class women and slaves were relatively uncommon due to the constraints placed upon white women's sexuality in the South, It's important to acknowledge that 19th century contraceptive methods were limited and not as effective as today's, leaving the possibility of pregnancy a significant concern. Nevertheless, sexual contact between white women and black men did take place in slaveholding societies, a phenomenon that might be less recognized than it should be. Despite strict regulation of Southern white women's sexuality, their sexual desires were acknowledged within the slaveholding culture, while control was emphasized. The existence of their sexuality was not denied. Historian Elizabeth Fox Genovese points out that white women exhibited a notable absence of neurotic inhibition. Instances of pre- and extramarital sex were evident, albeit not as frequently as their male counterparts. Although 19th century contraceptive techniques were not as advanced as modern options, they did exist. Condoms made from various materials, along with other contraceptive methods, were used to prevent pregnancies. Additionally, abortion was largely unregulated during this period and was not limited to specific social groups. This suggests that upper and middle-class white women could have considered these options to engage in affairs with black men without fear of pregnancy. There is a possibility that affairs between white women and slaves occurred more frequently than recorded or noticed. The focus on moral transgressions might have centered more around white men's actions, making the idea of a white woman engaging in such relationships less expected or likely to be documented. In essence, while the dangers of producing a mixed-race child through relations with a black man were significant, historical evidence suggests that contraceptive techniques and abortion practices were available and used by white women of various social classes. This could have provided some level of assurance against unwanted pregnancies resulting from such affairs. In cases where upper-class women were suspected of engaging in affairs with slaves, they could use the image of chastity to protect themselves by accusing the slave of rape. This was a strategy to deflect blame and maintain their reputation. The perception of black men as inherently lustful and prone to sexual vice played into this dynamic, making it easier for a white woman to accuse a black man of rape than a white man. This illustrates how societal prejudices were leveraged to shift blame and protect the social standing of white women. The motivations for these relationships varied by situation. Some women might have engaged in sexual relationships with slaves due to boredom or sexual frustration. It's possible that for women with limited power relative to white men, exploiting slaves sexually could provide a sense of enjoyment and control, giving them a taste of power that they were otherwise denied. When affairs between white women and slaves were exposed, the consequences were harsh. Great efforts were made to cover up pregnancies resulting from these relationships, which could involve selling the resulting child into slavery or resorting to infanticide to avoid scandal. Instances of such public humiliation underscore the social importance placed on maintaining the facade of white women's virtue and purity. Indeed, the accounts of relationships between white women and slaves, particularly when analyzed through a modern lens, highlight a disturbing pattern of sexually predatory behavior and power dynamics. While these relationships might not have been perceived as such by the individuals involved at the time, they demonstrate a clear exertion of sexual control over slaves, revealing complex forms of abuse and manipulation. White women also exercised sexual control over slaves through threats of accusing them of rape or attempted rape. This manipulation played into patriarchal norms that positioned white women as weak and in need of male protection. By extending this control to include racial dynamics, elite white women further solidified both white supremacy and patriarchy. In doing so, they chose to perpetuate existing power structures rather than challenge them. One underlying motivation for sexually exploiting slaves might have been to compensate for the lack of power that planter-class women held in other aspects of their lives. As property of their husbands and with limited sexual agency relative to men, these women likely found a source of enjoyment and empowerment through their exploitation of slaves. In summary, the relationships between white women and slaves were marked by sexual control, manipulation, and abuse. These dynamics stem from a combination of motivations, power imbalances, and the broader societal context. Understanding these historical interactions requires a nuanced analysis that considers both gender and race, shedding light on the complexity of power structures and their impact on individuals' actions within them. As we move through history, it's important to remember the past if we want to make a more fair future. Don't miss the next video, subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and press the bell icon for more updates.